I'm Reverend Susan Hendershot, President of Interfaith Power and Light, and I'm ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Well, interestingly enough, so as president of IPL, I'm based in Oakland, California. I've been there for the last 2 years, and prior to that, I lived in Iowa for 26 years. So I'm a Midwestern girl at heart, but now living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Well, this is my first time being at the COP, so my initial impression of being at the COP was, wow, this is really overwhelming, and I'm so jet lagged that I actually can't figure out what I'm supposed to be doing right now. But now that we're a few days in, I'm kind of settled into the process. I was telling someone recently that it was really good to start out the day with a planned schedule for what I was going to do every day, and then to be completely willing to throw it out the window and do other things as opportunities came up. So that's sort of how the schedule's been for me. One of the most exciting opportunities that I've had so far is being a part of a delegation of 9 faith representatives from the U.S. who were able to meet with our U.S. congressional delegation that was here, and to really have a fairly substantial conversation about priorities for each of the organizations. I emphasized, for example, with IPL that a lot of our focus has been on mitigation, even though we're doing some additional work now towards adaptation as well. But sharing a little bit about the work that we do, and then really hearing from them what it is that they need from the faith communities back home. And essentially what the message was we need to hear from our constituents in our districts as people of faith, talking about why climate change is important to them and how this can really reach across the political aisle. Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. We've been talking about decoding the COP for faith communities back home, and I think essentially what we're talking about is the fact that what happens here at the international level is really interconnected to what happens both back home at the federal level and then also at the local and state level. So this morning I had an opportunity to be at the opening of the U.S. Climate Action Center that's located here at the COP. And what we heard from panelists who were there is the sense that we can't deliver on international promises that we can't make progress on at home. And so whether that is federal policy like the 100% clean economy bill that was recently introduced in the House, or whether that's protecting EPA safeguards like the clean car standards or the methane standards, for example. Those are incredibly important, but the other thing that has to happen is that cities and states have to take action for us to meet our goals as well and surpass our goals with more ambitious targets. So this COP is a lot about ambition, and so we're talking about more ambitious roles for cities and states, whether that's 100% clean energy targets, city climate action plans, anything that can happen at the state level to advance renewable energy, energy efficiency, and our state affiliates are already doing that work around the country. So as you said, we have 40 state affiliates who are actively working around the country, and this is exactly the kind of work that we can deliver on, because people of faith have a different role to play. We have a very unique voice in this conversation. We can come to this from the moral standpoint and talk about how we not only have a moral obligation to protect this planet for our children and our grandchildren, but we also have a moral opportunity to lead. And I think that's the exciting thing for us to be able to deliver back home, is to talk about that moral opportunity and how all of us working together is how we solve this crisis. Well, U.S. faith communities, I think, have a really unique role when we talk about human rights. Denominational bodies, faith communities in the U.S., don't operate in a vacuum. They're very much part of a global community. So for example, many of our denominational bodies like the United Methodist Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, they are global faith bodies, and they have sister parishes in other parts of the world. They're actively doing all kinds of charity and justice work that is addressing issues globally. And so when we situate ourselves in that context, it's really easy to bring in the connection to how, for example, more fossil fuel development around the world, deforestation that is happening globally is actually driving more human rights abuses all over the world, and even in the US, as a matter of fact. And so when we put it in that context, we can see why the US faith community really needs to work to develop, or work to eliminate more fossil fuel development, to protect indigenous rights, for example, and also to look at the development of a more equitable global economy as really being in the best interest of both the U.S. and protecting ourselves from global conflict as well. So there are all kinds of really intersectional issues here, and it is one of the things that's happened at the COP. So for example, I was in a session yesterday morning at one of the side events that was on human rights and climate change, and talking about very specific examples in places like Colombia and Indonesia where more mining, more deforestation is driving people from the land. Because of their culture, they traditionally do not own the land, and so they have no rights, as we would say, to be on the land, but these are their traditional lands, and they're being pushed off and marginalized, and they're also not being included in decision-making processes or having a seat at the table. So this is, further exacerbating some of the human rights abuses globally. Yeah, I mean, I think that we like our issues siloed because it feels easier, to manage, just like, climate change or hunger or water, immigration, whatever it is. And climate change is a big tent issue, right? It is so intersected to all of these other issues. It exacerbates all of these other issues. And for me personally, I came to the issue of climate change through the lens of hunger. That was the issue that I worked on for many years as a pastor in a local congregation, was the issue of hunger. And it wasn't until I made the connection between the loss of harvest due to drought and wildfire that were fueled by climate change, and increasing global food shortages, and rising grain prices, and the rise of conflict in some parts of the world around that, I was able to make the connection that, I need to work on climate change. Like, this is a root driver of this issue. And so for me, I think part of the work of an organization like Interfaith Power and Light is to connect the dots for people who otherwise might not see the connection. For example, that climate change and drought is actually, forcing climate migration, which is resulting in, all kinds of immigration issues in the United States, for example. And so once we start to bring those issues together and not separate them out as being distinct, I think that is where we start raising the number of activists who are advocating for climate and energy policy in the U.S. And also the clear health impacts of climate change that are being demonstrated by all kinds of great organizations that we partner with. And so looking at how we intersect these issues in a way that will help people understand, connect the dots, and then become advocates and take action themselves, and also make some of the personal lifestyle changes that we all need to make in order to leave a fair share for everyone. I mean, I think for me, ultimately, this goes back to common values. And so the sense that I have in being here in this space, listening and learning from other people who are working across sectors, working in multiple countries around the world, is that we're doing this because of what we value. And I think that can resonate in a bipartisan way in the US as well, because when we can have a conversation with someone that talks about where we connect, what do we have in common, what do we love, right? What do we care about? We might disagree with how we get there, right? Like, what are the exact mechanisms for how we do this? But ultimately, I think if we can come together and say, I'm doing this work because I love my sons and I care about the future that they have living in this world, and to find that someone who I maybe disagree with on a lot of policy things actually shares that common value with me, I think we can connect in a way that will allow us to have a conversation about the mechanisms, right? And so I think that that's important, and I think that's what I see demonstrated here, is a sense that people are doing this because they care, because they really honestly care about this work, they care about this world, they care about our children and our grandchildren, and they want to leave something for those who come after us. One of the things that's making me anxious here is just sort of the rumblings that there isn't much of substance happening, for example, we heard yesterday that the United States and Russia were given the Fossil of the Day award by the Climate Action Network, which is, of course, not to be honored by that. And the U.S. was given that award because the U.S. is saying, well, it doesn't really think that finance should be a part of this conversation. But yet at the same time, the U.S. has traditionally been the largest driver of greenhouse gas emissions globally. We absolutely have a responsibility to other nations, especially developing nations and vulnerable nations, who are going to have to quickly adapt and don't have the resources in order to do that. And so I do think there's a moral obligation for us to act on that. And hearing things like that does make me anxious that the U.S. is not delivering on its promises that it made in Paris, and has, is sort of continuing to inch away from the Paris Agreement, as we know. And so one of the reasons that I think it's so important that there are so many people from the U.S. who are here in this space is to demonstrate to other nations that we really are still in. Despite what this administration might be saying, that that the U.S. civil society, that businesses, that faith organizations, that universities and colleges and all the rest really do still support action on climate. And so I hope that message will be heard back at home and by the U.S. delegation that's here. So one of the things that I really want to take back to our IPL network across the United States is, first of all, just continuing to build the connection between what's happening at the state and local level and our federal level work with why it's important from a global perspective to continue to maintain a presence at future COPs. So that's one piece of what I want to take back, but the other piece is really just how important it is for us to continue to demonstrate how the U.S. faith community is still in Paris. And that can be anything from congregations that are installing rooftop solar, really as an act of faith. It might also be a budgetary consideration, but it's because culturally it's what we believe is right and how we want to live in God's creation, right? We want to take care of this earth. And so, continuing to build on steps that congregations, individuals, families, people of faith and conscience around the United States are already taking, whether that's through personal action or through their advocacy efforts, that all of that continues to build a very loud, noticeable voice when we come to these global conferences and can demonstrate specifically what U.S. faith communities are already doing. So just to continue to support and encourage our affiliate leaders with the work that they're doing, I think is incredibly important, and it does resonate well here when we can share specific stories of what's happening on the ground.